Hello, I want to cover some pieces about Nigeria before we start wrapping this unit up and you taking your quiz. So to start off, there are three main branches of government for Nigeria, which is very similar to the United States. They have a president. The president serves as the chief of state. The president serves as the commander-in-chief. The president serves a 4-year term. Some things that are interesting is that the president must win a majority of votes nationwide and have at least 25% of the ballots cast in at least 2/3 of the states in order for the president to be declared the winner. If no one wins 2/3 in the first round, then there is a runoff election between the top two vote getters from round one. I think it's important to understand the significance of that. To me, that ties into federalism and that they want the person to represent geographically diverse sections of the country, but also it's an attempt to provide a mathematical incentive to try to campaign in all the different states and to try to create some sort of unity, as opposed to only talk to the region of the country that you are have the strongest ties to. The president gets to pick the vice presidential candidate. And once the president is elected, the president gets to pick their federal executive council. To me, this seems similar to the cabinet. And the president gets to pick their ministers who are going to help them carry out and actually oversee the government. The Constitution requires that the president must appoint ministers from each of the states. And so there shouldn't be a state and therefore a representative group of people or ethnic group that would be left out of the inner cabinet for the president. And this quota system is called the federal character principle. And it was put forward in the Constitution as a way to try to promote unity in Nigeria. For their legislative branch, they have a bicameral National Assembly. It has a House of Representatives and a Senate to it. The House of Representatives has 360 seats, and they have single-member plurality districts. They use a winner-take-all system, so whoever wins the most votes in that one particular district gets to be the person who is representative at the House of Representatives. Both the House and the Senate have 4-year terms, and both of them are up for re-election at the same time that the president is up for election, because the president also serves a 4-year term. Historically, the legislative branch has been a rubber stamp to the president and hasn't necessarily challenged the president, and this is for a couple of reasons. One, most of the time, the legislative branch has been from the same party as the president, and so they don't challenge their party leader. Second of all, the legislative branch has less experience, less expertise, and less staff support, so they don't also feel as qualified to be able to challenge or provide a check to the president. And lastly, Nigeria has a strong tradition of having a strong executive and has a weak tradition of having any checks to that strong executive, which makes it difficult for the legislative branch to sort of step up in this area. The judiciary has played more of a voice in terms of being a check. The judiciary is a system that was inherited from British colonial rule. What they did when setting up the judiciary when Nigeria became a British colony is they combined common law statute, just like they use common law in England, and they combined that with traditional and customary laws. And from the get-go, included Sharia law in the Muslim sections of Nigeria. So this idea of having different sort of judicial systems in different parts of the country in order to accommodate the diversity of Nigeria is something that, for example, they inherited. Okay. One of the most important examples that people use when talking about the judiciary is the Saro-Wigan trial in 1995. Now, this was not during the Fourth Republic, but it's important to still understand this. Saro-Wigan founded the Movement for the Survival of the Ogoni People, MOSOP, and this organization challenged the government's revenue-sharing formulas, which kept the bulk of the oil wealth flowing to the national government, and meant that the part of the country where the Niger Delta is, where all the oil is found, was very poor, and it meant that they were kept in poverty, but the national government and the people who worked for the national government were receiving all of this wealth. Saro-Wigan and other activists led national protests against the military government, led national protests against Shell Oil, and they were arrested on trumped-up charges, him and this organization, and brought before a special military tribunal. And the show trial returned a guilty verdict, and in November of 1995, the government actually hanged all 9 of the defendants, despite an international outcry and the efforts of international human rights groups and the leaders of dozens of countries to intervene. The 1999 Constitution established, the Supreme Court, the Federal Court of Appeals, and a unified court system, and there has been more of a rule of law that's been set up since then. I think it's important to know about the Saro-Wigan trial, even though it's not an example from the Fourth Republic, because they frequently like to ask questions about the role of dissent, the role of civil liberties, as well as about environmental destruction. And I think being able to talk about him as well as the MOSOP is important to have that in your toolbox. There are Sharia courts, and they function in 12 of the predominantly Muslim northern states, and there are also frequently questions on the AP exam that ask you to compare the role of Sharia law in Nigeria with the role of Sharia law in Iran. In terms of the electoral system and political parties, it's important to understand that parties in Nigeria have not historically been ideological. They have not been organized as being leftists or rightists or moderates, but instead have been organized regionally, because that is one of the major cleavages in Nigeria, is that different ethnic groups live in different regions of Nigeria. And so that has been how people have been organized. The People's Democratic Party, the PDP, has been the party that in the Fourth Republic has had the most power, and it was perceived as Nigeria's dominant party, and it put in an informal arrangement designed to enhance the legitimacy of presidential elections when they moved to democracy during the Fourth Republic. Christian politicians from the South feared that democracy would always favor the more numerous Muslim population in the north, and that the southern candidates would thereby be shut out of power. And so what they did is they created a presidential rotation system called zoning. And it is important that you understand zoning. The party would alternate every 2 terms, nominating candidates from the north and the south. And they hoped that this agreement would facilitate support for reestablishing democratic rule and preventing it from going back to a coup d'etat. However, it limited the pool of qualified presidential candidates, and it ended up exacerbating ethnic tensions as opposed to cooling them down, which is what their intention was, because it framed issues and policy priorities in terms of alternating regions and religions. This comes to a head with Goodluck Jonathan. He's the previous president. He was the vice president. But in 2010, the President Yar'Adua, a northern Muslim who succeeded a southern Christian, died in office. And so Goodluck Jonathan, who was a Christian from the South, became president. Everybody assumed that he would just step aside when his term was done, but he ran for re-election, and this broke the zoning agreement. Okay, and so people were upset about this. What happened is that then in 2013, there was a merger of 3 different large opposition parties and creating a new party called the All Progressive Congress, the APC party. And a lot of people from the northern PDP party actually left to join this APC party, and this strengthened the opposition. And they elected Buhari, a northern Muslim, as its candidate, and he then won the presidential race in 2015, thus preserving this informal zoning rotation. People think that this is important because that election in 2015 was the first time in Nigeria's history that they actually had a non-incumbent win. And they had sort of this like peaceful transition of power, and people were really excited about it. Buhari's commanding win in the 2000 presidential election not only got him elected, but it also carried many APC legislative candidates on his coattails. And so now the APC is a majority in both chambers, whereas before it had always been the PDP. And so we've had some recent changes. And so now political scientists would say that Nigeria is entering a period of being a 2-party system as opposed to a 1-party system. And the article that you had read from the College Board did not give you this type of up-to-date information, so I thought it was important for us to cover it here. In terms of key elections, it's important to understand that in this Fourth Republic period, there have been 5 free and fair elections. I already talked about Goodluck Jonathan, but I think another important thing for you to know about him is that he strengthened the Nigerian Electoral Commission and accredited someone that everybody felt like was like this super honest academic, and that has been credited with making the elections in 2011 and 2015 the cleanest in Nigeria's history. And so, like, I could see a question that asks you to compare the Nigerian Electoral Commission with the IFE in Mexico. It's important to note, though, that even though the elections in 2011 and 2015 were cleaner, that unfortunately the 2011 election was marred with significant violence. Like, people were killed around election day, on election day, candidates were targeted. I mean, so they still have a lot of work to do in terms of making Nigeria a safer democracy. The last thing I wanted to talk about is the role of the military as an institution. It's a key institution, probably more so than any of the other countries that we've talked about. Most powerful leaders have some sort of military background, including presidents. President Obasanjo passed legislation in the early 2000s requiring the retirement of all military officers who had previously held political offices during the period of military rule. And this is seen as an important step during the Fourth Republic to decrease chances of another military coup. As we've talked about before, the military actually represents all of Nigeria better than the political parties because Nigeria's military has been seen as this stable meritocracy. Unlike other parts of the government, which are seen as very corrupt, the military has historically been seen as a way for people to get social mobility, particularly if you are a poor person who is Muslim from the north. It is seen as a way that you have had the opportunity to access political power, and I think that's important to note in its history.